There's a reason people in Yukon avoid talking about what they've seen. Not because they're afraid of creatures, but because they fear their own minds if those memories resurface. Tonight on Midnight Whispers Stories, I'll take you through 9 disturbing Yukon horror stories that quietly broke the sanity of those who lived them. Stay until the end. The last case is the one that makes even seasoned investigators question what's real. Story 1. Fox Lake UFO Crash and the Men in Black and White Horse. The pale man standing in my doorway at 3 in the morning had eyes that did not blink. And when he smiled at me with teeth too white and too perfect, I understood that whatever crashed into Fox Lake that night in 1965 had brought something to the Yukon that was never supposed to be here, and now it knew my name. My name is Robert Henshaw, and I was a bush pilot operating out of Whitehorse in the spring of 1965. I had been flying these northern routes for 12 years, hauling supplies to remote mining camps, transporting hunters and trappers, doing the occasional search and rescue when someone got lost in the wilderness. I thought I had seen everything the Yukon sky could show me. Northern lights that danced across the heavens, electrical storms that lit up the horizon like artillery fire, weather systems that appeared out of nowhere and tried to knock you from the sky. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for what I witnessed on the night of May 14th, and nothing prepared me for what came looking for me 3 days later. It started with a radio call around 11:30 that night. I was at home in Whitehorse, already in bed, when my phone rang. It was dispatch, a woman named Carol who handled communications for the local aviation authority. Her voice was shaking, words coming fast and breathless. She said multiple witnesses were reporting something falling from the sky near Fox Lake, about 50 miles northwest of town. Witnesses described a bright object, glowing orange and red, trailing fire as it descended, moving too slowly to be a meteor but too fast to be an aircraft. The RCMP had already been notified, and they were requesting any available aircraft to do a flyover at first light, try to locate the crash site if there was one. Carol asked if I could take the job. I told her yes, that I would be ready to fly at dawn, and hung up feeling that strange mixture of curiosity and unease that comes when something happens that does not fit normal patterns. I could not sleep after that call. I kept thinking about the description, an object falling from the sky trailing fire, and trying to match it to anything I knew. A plane would have shown up on radar, would have issued distress calls. A meteor would have fallen faster, would have impacted with enough force to register on seismographs. Whatever this was existed in between, something that felt like it had some control, some ability to slow its descent. At 5 in the morning I drove to the airport and started pre-flight checks on my Cessna 185. The sky was clear, temperature just above freezing, perfect flying conditions. I was airborne by 6, banking northwest toward Fox Lake, watching the sun rise over the mountains and paint the landscape in shades of gold and pink. The flight took about 40 minutes. Fox Lake is a remote body of water surrounded by dense boreal forest and rocky terrain, accessible only by air or a brutal overland route that takes days. As I approached, I started scanning the tree line, looking for signs of impact, smoke, disturbed forest, anything that would indicate where something had come down. I found it about 2 miles south of the main lake, and the sight made me pull back on the throttle and circle lower, trying to understand what I was seeing. There was a gouge in the forest, maybe 300 feet long. Trees snapped and pushed aside in a straight line that terminated in a clearing where something had impacted. But this was not the crater you would expect from a high-speed crash. The trees were bent outward from a central point, pushed aside rather than shattered, as if something had landed with force but also with some degree of control. And in the center of that clearing, partially buried in earth and surrounded by scorched vegetation, was an object that made my hands tighten on the controls and my breath catch in my throat. It was metallic, maybe 30 feet across, smooth and featureless except for what looked like seams or panels along its surface. The shape was wrong, not aerodynamic in any way I recognized, more like a flattened sphere or a disc. And it was glowing faintly, a dull orange pulse that seemed to come from within the metal itself, like it was still hot from atmospheric entry or powered by something I could not identify. I circled 3 times, taking photographs with my handheld camera, trying to document what I was seeing while also fighting the instinctive urge to climb away and put distance between myself and that thing. The forest around it was completely silent from what I could observe. No birds, no movement, just that eerie stillness that sometimes precedes something terrible. I radioed back to dispatch and reported what I had found, giving coordinates and a description that I knew sounded insane even as the words left my mouth. Carol's voice came back shaky and uncertain, telling me to return to base immediately, that the RCMP would handle it from here, that I should not discuss what I had seen with anyone. The flight back felt longer than it should have. That image of the object burned into my mind, the wrongness of it sitting heavy in my gut. When I landed, there were already vehicles at the airport, RCMP cruisers and 2 black sedans that I did not recognize. Men in suits were standing near my plane as I taxied in, watching me with expressions that were hard to read but definitely not friendly. I was taken to a small office and questioned for 3 hours. They wanted to know exactly what I had seen, where it was located, who else I had told. The RCMP officers were professional but clearly uncomfortable, asking their questions by rote as if reading from a script. But it was the other men, the ones in the black suits, who made my skin crawl. There were 2 of them, and they introduced themselves as government officials, showing identification that looked official but somehow wrong, the font slightly off, the photos too perfect. They were both unusually pale, skin that looked like it had never seen sunlight, and their eyes were odd, pupils that seemed slightly too large, unblinking stares that lasted seconds too long. When they spoke, their voices were flat and monotone, words carefully enunciated as if English was not their native language or as if they were reading phonetically from memory. They told me that what I had seen was classified, that it was a matter of national security, that I was forbidden from discussing it with anyone under penalty of law. They said the crash site had already been secured, that the object would be removed and studied, that my photographs would be confiscated and destroyed. One of them leaned very close to me, close enough that I could smell something chemical and strange on his breath, and told me that if I spoke about this to anyone, there would be consequences that extended beyond legal prosecution. The threat was clear even if the exact nature of those consequences was not. I handed over my camera, signed documents that I barely read, and was released with the understanding that I would never mention Fox Lake or what I had seen there to anyone. I tried to follow their instructions. I went home, told my wife I had been working a routine flight, avoided conversations at the local bar where pilots gathered to swap stories. But I could not stop thinking about that object, about the way it glowed and pulsed, about the unnatural silence of the forest around it. And I could not stop thinking about those men in black suits, the wrongness of their appearance, the way they moved with a stiffness that suggested they were uncomfortable in their own bodies. 3 days after my flight to Fox Lake, I woke at 3 in the morning to the sound of someone knocking on my front door. Not pounding or urgent knocking, just slow, measured taps, rhythmic and patient, the kind of sound that suggests whoever is out there knows you are awake and will wait as long as necessary. I got out of bed quietly, trying not to wake my wife, and walked to the living room. Through the window beside the door, I could see a figure standing on my porch, silhouetted against the dim street light. It was one of the men in black suits, the same impossibly pale skin, the same rigid posture, standing motionless and staring directly at the door as if he could see through it. I did not want to open that door. Every instinct screamed at me to go back to bed, to pretend I had not heard the knocking, to hide until morning and hope he would be gone. But I also knew, with a certainty I could not explain, that he would not leave, that he would stand there all night if necessary, patient and implacable. I opened the door a crack, keeping the chain engaged, and looked out at him. Up close he was even more disturbing, skin so pale it was almost translucent, showing faint blue veins beneath the surface. His eyes were completely black in the darkness, no visible iris or pupil, just dark pools that reflected no light. When he smiled, his lips pulled back too far, showing teeth that were too white, too perfect, arranged in a way that was almost human but not quite. He asked if he could come inside. His voice was that same flat monotone, carefully enunciated words that sounded rehearsed. I told him no, asked what he wanted at 3 in the morning. He said he needed to discuss my flight to Fox Lake, that there had been concerns about my discretion, that he wanted to ensure I understood the importance of maintaining silence. I told him I had not spoken to anyone, that I understood the terms of the agreement I had signed. He nodded slowly, movements mechanical and precise, and said that was good, that it was very important I continue to remain silent. Then he said something that made my blood run cold. He said he knew I had been thinking about the object, that he knew I had questions about what it was and where it came from. He said those questions were dangerous, that curiosity could lead to problems, that some knowledge was not meant for human minds. The way he said human minds, with a slight pause before the words, suggested he was not including himself in that category. Then he leaned closer, and I could see that his eyes were not just black, they were wrong. The surface moving slightly like liquid, shapes shifting beneath that dark surface. He told me that the object had been removed, that the crash site had been sanitized, that there was no evidence anything had ever happened. But he also said that they would be watching me, that if I spoke about this or tried to investigate further, they would know immediately, and they would return. He asked if I understood. I nodded, unable to speak, throat tight with fear. He smiled again, that too wide pulling of lips over perfect teeth, and turned to leave. He walked down my porch steps with movements that were stiff and unnatural, climbed into one of those black sedans parked at the curb, and drove away into the darkness. I stood in my doorway for a long time after he left, shaking, trying to process what had just happened. My wife found me there 20 minutes later, asked what was wrong. I told her I had trouble sleeping, that I had gotten up for some air, a lie that tasted bitter but necessary. Over the following weeks, I started hearing stories from other witnesses. A trapper who had been near Fox Lake that night reported seeing the object fall, described it almost exactly as I had seen it. 2 days after making his report to the RCMP, he was visited by men in black suits who questioned him aggressively and left him so terrified that he packed up his trap lines and moved to British Columbia. A family driving on the Alaska Highway claimed to have seen the object in the sky before it descended, glowing and pulsing with that strange orange light. They were visited the next day, threatened into silence, told their children would be taken if they spoke about what they had seen. Everyone who witnessed the Fox Lake incident or tried to talk about it was silenced the same way, visited by those pale men with their black suits and their unblinking eyes, threatened with consequences that were never fully explained but clearly severe. And slowly, over the course of a few months, the whole thing disappeared. No official reports, no news coverage, no investigation. It was as if nothing had ever happened, as if that object had never fallen from the sky and those men in black had never existed. But I knew the truth. I had seen the crash site, photographed that impossible object, looked into the eyes of those things that wore human faces like poorly fitted masks. And I knew that whatever had crashed near Fox Lake was not from anywhere on Earth, and whatever came to cover it up was not human, despite their suits and their official identification. I left the Yukon in 1967, moved south to Vancouver with my wife, told people I wanted to be closer to civilization, needed better opportunities. The real reason was that I could not stay in Whitehorse knowing that those things were out there, watching, waiting, ready to return if I ever broke my silence. I kept that silence for over 50 years. I never told my children, never discussed it with friends, buried the memory as deep as I could and tried to pretend it had never happened. But now I am 87 years old, dying of cancer that the doctors say will take me within months, and I have decided that some truths need to be told. Consequences be damned. The Fox Lake crash happened. Something not from this world fell into the Yukon wilderness in 1965, and something else, something that could pass for human but was fundamentally other, came to cover it up and silence anyone who knew. The RCMP files on the incident do not exist, or if they do, they are buried so deep that nobody will ever find them. The witnesses are scattered or dead, their stories dismissed as hallucinations or lies. But I was there. I saw the object glowing in that forest clearing, photographed the impossible metal and the scorched earth around it. And I looked into the eyes of those pale men in black suits and understood that we are not alone, that there are things moving through our world that we are not meant to see or understand. Sometimes late at night, even here in Vancouver, thousands of miles from the Yukon, I wake to the sound of slow, measured knocking on my door. I look through the window and see nothing, but I know they are still out there, still watching, making sure I keep the silence they demanded all those years ago. And I wonder if telling this story now, at the end of my life, will bring them back one final time. The horror is not that something crashed near Fox Lake. The horror is that it was covered up so completely, so efficiently, by things that wore human faces but were not human at all. And somewhere in a warehouse or facility that does not officially exist, that object still waits, studied by minds we cannot comprehend, while the rest of us go about our lives pretending we are alone in the universe. We are not alone. We never were, and the things that visit us do not want us to know they are here. Story 2. Possessed by the Gold Rush. the Keno City Hotel exorcism. The scratching on my bedroom wall started 3 nights ago, and it sounds exactly like fingernails clawing through wood, desperate to get inside. My name is Father David Sullivan, and I am a Catholic priest serving remote communities across the Yukon territory. What I witnessed in the winter of 1956 at the Keno City Hotel was the most terrifying encounter with pure evil I have ever experienced, and it has haunted me for nearly 70 years. This is my true story, my confession, and I swear on everything holy that every word of it happened exactly as I describe. I was 32 years old when I received the urgent telegram from Keno City, a dying mining town about 30 miles north of Mayo. The message was brief but chilling. Come immediately. Man possessed. Violent. Need exorcism. The local constable had sent it, which told me this was serious. Police do not ask for priests unless something has gone very wrong. I arrived on a freezing February evening, the kind of cold that makes your lungs burn with every breath. Keno City was barely a town anymore, just a handful of buildings clustered around an exhausted silver mine. Most people had left when the ore ran out, and the few who remained were either too stubborn or too broken to start over somewhere else. The hotel stood at the center of town, a 3-story wooden structure that had been elegant once but now sagged under the weight of too many harsh winters. Every window was dark except for one on the 2nd floor, where lamplight flickered like a dying heartbeat. Constable Mackenzie met me at the door. He was a big man, tough as they come, but his hands were shaking as he led me inside. He told me the man, his name was Thomas Hartley, a quiet miner who had worked the claims around Keno for 20 years. A gentle soul, Mackenzie said. Never caused trouble, never raised his voice, until 4 days ago. Thomas had been working an old abandoned claim up in the hills, clearing out a collapsed shaft that dated back to the 1898 gold rush. He came back to town that evening acting strange. Quiet at first, then agitated. By midnight he was screaming in his room, smashing furniture, speaking in a voice that was not his own. The constable had tried to restrain him. Thomas threw him across the room with one hand like he weighed nothing. It took 4 men to drag Thomas back to his room and barricade the door. That was 3 days ago, and he had not stopped screaming since. I could hear it as we climbed the stairs. Not words exactly, but sounds. Guttural, animal sounds mixed with fragments of language I did not recognize. And underneath that, a voice that made my skin crawl. Deep and oily and wrong, like something ancient forcing its way through a human throat. We stopped outside room 7. The door was reinforced with boards nailed across the frame. Scratches covered the wood, deep gouges that looked like they had been made with bare hands. The smell that leaked through the cracks was overwhelming. Rotten sulfur and something else, something that reminded me of old coins covered in dirt. Mackenzie unlocked the door but would not go inside. He just stepped back and crossed himself, his face pale. I said a prayer, gripped my Bible and crucifix, and pushed the door open. The room was destroyed, furniture overturned, wallpaper torn away in strips. And in the center of it all, chained to the iron bed frame, was Thomas Hartley. Except it was not Thomas anymore. Not really. The man I saw had Thomas, his body, but everything else was wrong. His skin had a gray pallor, like old meat. His eyes were bloodshot and yellow, darting around the room with predatory intelligence. His lips were pulled back in a permanent snarl, revealing teeth that seemed longer than they should be. When he saw me, he smiled, and that smile was the most disturbing thing I had ever seen on a human face. The voice that came out of him was not his own. It was older, harder, thick with an accent I could not place. It spoke in a mocking tone that made my blood run cold. Well, they sent the little priest. Come to save poor Thomas? Have you? Too late. Far too late. I have been waiting 60 years to get back what is mine. I stepped closer, holding the crucifix out in front of me. The thing inside Thomas hissed and recoiled, but then it started laughing. A horrible, wet sound that echoed off the walls. I demanded to know what it was. The thing grinned wider and told me its name was Jonas Cryer, and it had died in 1898 with a bullet in its back and gold dust in its pockets. A claim jumper, it said. A thief. It had killed 3 men for their stake and was murdered in turn by the 4th before it could enjoy its stolen wealth. It had been waiting ever since, trapped in the darkness of that collapsed mine shaft where its body was buried, waiting for someone to dig it out, to give it away back. And Thomas had done exactly that. I began the rites of exorcism, reciting the prayers in Latin, commanding the demon to leave this man in the name of God. But something was wrong. The entity was not reacting the way it should. It was not weakening or showing fear. It was getting stronger. The temperature in the room dropped so fast I could see my breath. Frost formed on the walls. The lamp flames turned blue and started to gutter. And Thomas, or the thing wearing Thomas, began to change. His body convulsed, bones cracking and reshaping under the skin. His hands twisted into claws. His neck elongated. And his face, dear God, his face began to look like someone else entirely. Older, meaner, with eyes that burned with hatred and greed. This was not a simple possession. This was something worse. The spirit of Jonas Cryer had not just invaded Thomas, this body. It was consuming it, remaking it, and if I did not stop it soon, Thomas would be gone forever and something ancient and evil would walk the earth in his place. I intensified the prayers, calling on every saint, every holy name I knew. The thing screamed and thrashed, the chains holding it groaning under the strain. Black fluid began leaking from its eyes and mouth, pooling on the floor and steaming in the freezing air. Then it spoke in a different voice. Thomas's voice, weak and desperate and terrified. It was begging me to help, saying it was still in there, still fighting, but losing. The thing was showing it things, memories of 1898, of murder and theft, and the moment Jonas Cryer died choking on his own blood, consumed by rage that his gold would go to someone else. That rage had kept him conscious even in death, had turned him into something that refused to move on, and now wanted revenge, wanted to finish what it started, wanted gold and blood and life, no matter who it had to destroy to get them. I realized then what I had to do. This was not about prayer or ritual. This was about breaking the connection between Jonas Cryer, a spirit, and the physical world. And that connection was the gold. I asked the constable where Thomas had been working, what he had found in that mine shaft. Mackenzie told me Thomas had brought back a leather pouch, old and rotted, filled with gold dust and a few nuggets. It was in the hotel safe downstairs. I ran down the stairs, ignoring the sounds of Thomas screaming behind me. I found the safe, forced it open, and grabbed the pouch. The leather was freezing cold, burning my hands even through my gloves. And I could feel something pulsing inside it, like a heartbeat, like something alive. I carried it outside into the freezing night and dumped the contents onto the snow. Gold dust and nuggets scattered across the white surface, glittering in the moonlight. And mixed in with the gold were other things. Teeth, bone fragments, scraps of cloth stained dark brown with ancient blood. I poured holy water over it all and set it on fire using lamp oil from the hotel. The gold did not burn, but everything else did. And as the flames rose higher, I heard screaming from inside the hotel. Not Thomas's voice. The other one. Jonas Cryer, shrieking in fury and pain as his connection to the physical world burned away. The fire burned for hours, long after normal flames would have died. It burned blue and green in colors I have no names for. And when it finally went out, nothing remained but blackened snow and a few melted lumps of gold that looked more like slag than precious metal. I went back inside. The hotel was silent. I climbed the stairs slowly, terrified of what I would find. Thomas was still chained to the bed, but he was unconscious. His body had returned to normal. His face was his own again. He was breathing steadily, peacefully, like a man in deep sleep. He woke up 3 days later with no memory of what had happened. The last thing he remembered was digging in that mine shaft and finding the leather pouch. Everything after that was blank. I told him he had been very sick, that he had suffered some kind of fever or poisoning from bad air in the mine. He accepted that explanation gratefully and left Keno City the following week, saying the place gave him bad dreams. The constable and I agreed to keep the truth quiet. Who would believe us anyway? We filed a report saying Thomas had temporary psychosis from carbon monoxide exposure. Case closed. But I know what really happened in that hotel room. I know what I saw. And I know that Jonas Cryer, his spirit was real, was evil, and was destroyed. Or so I thought. Last week, I received a letter from a mining company in Keno City. They are reopening the old silver claims, bringing in new equipment, digging deeper than anyone has dug before. And they mentioned something interesting in their survey report. They found human remains in one of the shafts. Old remains, from the gold rush era. And buried with the body was a large cache of gold that had never been recovered. They are bringing it all up next month. The bones and the gold. They are going to put it in a museum as a historical find. I wrote back immediately, begging them not to disturb the site. I explained that the remains should be given a proper Christian burial and the gold should be melted down or destroyed. I told them it was cursed. They sent a polite reply thanking me for my concern, but explaining that the find was too valuable to destroy. The artifacts would be carefully preserved and displayed. That was 3 weeks ago. And 3 nights ago, the scratching started on my bedroom wall. It sounds like fingernails, long fingernails, clawing through wood, trying to get inside, and sometimes, late at night, I hear a voice whispering through the wall. An old voice, an angry voice, a voice I recognize from that terrible night in 1956. It whispers the same thing over and over. You burned my gold. Priest, you stole what was mine. And now I am coming to collect what you owe me. I am 70 years old. I have spent my entire life serving God, and I am more afraid now than I have ever been. Because I know Jonas Cryer is still out there, still hungry, still filled with that terrible greed that would not let him rest even in death. And when they bring up his bones and his gold next month, he will have a way back into this world. I've tried to warn people. Nobody will listen. So I'm writing this down as a record, as a warning. If something happens to me, if I disappear or die under mysterious circumstances, you will know why. And if you ever hear about cursed gold from the Yukon, about artifacts from the 1898 gold rush causing strange incidents, remember this story. Remember what happened to Thomas Hartley. Remember that some things should stay buried. The scratching is getting louder tonight, and I swear I can see the wallpaper starting to tear. Story 3. Ice Cave Mummies. They weren't alone when we found them. I was standing in the ice cave staring at a perfectly preserved corpse from 1898 when I heard the whispers coming from deeper in the darkness, and that terrifying moment made me realize the dead miner was not alone down here. It was March 9th, 2007, and I was part of an archaeological expedition exploring a network of abandoned gold rush-era mine shafts in the mountains north of Dawson City in the Yukon Territory. We had been searching for artifacts and historical evidence of the Klondike Gold Rush when we discovered something that should have made headlines around the world. Instead, our findings were quietly suppressed, our audio recordings confiscated, and our team was paid a substantial amount of money to never discuss what we found in those frozen tunnels beneath the mountain. The official story reported the discovery of 3 naturally mummified miners, their bodies preserved by the cold, dry air of the cave system. What the official story did not mention was that the miners were not the only things we found down there, and that something in the darkness was very much alive and aware of our presence. The cave entrance was a vertical shaft about 40 feet deep, hidden by brush and rockfall, only discovered because of ground-penetrating radar we were using to map old mining operations. When we rappelled down into the opening, we found ourselves in a tunnel that had been hand-carved through solid rock and ice over a century ago. The walls glistened with frost, and our breath formed thick white clouds in the air. The temperature was a constant 20 degrees below zero, cold enough to preserve organic material indefinitely but not cold enough to make the ice unstable. The tunnel stretched back into the mountain, sloping downward, with side passages branching off at irregular intervals. We marked our route with reflective tape and moved carefully, testing the ice beneath our feet, aware that one wrong step could send us plunging into hidden crevasses or unstable sections of frozen ground. About 200 feet into the main tunnel, we found the first body. He was sitting against the wall, his legs stretched out in front of him, his hands resting in his lap like he had simply sat down to rest and never got back up. His clothes were intact, the heavy wool and leather of a gold rush-era miner, and his face was visible through a thin layer of frost. His eyes were open, staring at nothing, his expression peaceful. He had frozen to death quickly, probably caught in the cave during a sudden temperature drop, and the conditions had mummified him perfectly. We documented the first miner with photographs and measurements, treating the site with the respect it deserved. This was a tomb, a place where men had died pursuing dreams of gold and fortune in one of the harshest environments on Earth. But as we worked, I started to feel uneasy. There was a sensation of being watched, of presence in the darkness beyond our lights. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see something in the shadows, but there was never anything there. Just ice and rock and the bodies of dead miners. We found the second body 50 feet further into the tunnel. This one lying face down, his arms outstretched like he had been crawling when he died. The third body was in a small side chamber, curled into a fetal position, his hands covering his face. 3 men who had ventured into this frozen darkness chasing gold and had paid for their ambition with their lives. We set up our base camp in the chamber with the third body, using it as a central point for our exploration of the deeper tunnels. That was our first mistake. We should have documented the bodies and left immediately. Instead, we stayed, and as night fell outside the cave, something in the darkness began to wake up. The whispers started around 9 that evening. We were reviewing our findings, cataloging the artifacts we had recovered from around the bodies, when I heard it. Soft voices speaking in a language I did not recognize, coming from one of the side tunnels that branched off from our chamber. At first I thought it was wind moving through the cave system, creating sounds that mimicked human speech. But the more I listened, the more convinced I became that these were actual words, actual sentences being spoken by something or someone deeper in the cave. I mentioned it to the rest of the team. Dr. Sarah Chan, our expedition leader, told me it was probably acoustic effects, that caves were known for creating auditory illusions. But then she heard it too, and her expression changed. The whispers were getting louder, more distinct, and they seemed to be coming from multiple directions at once, echoing through the tunnels in a way that made it impossible to pinpoint their source. We decided to investigate, which was our second mistake. 3 of us ventured into the side tunnel where the sound seemed strongest, leaving 2 team members at base camp to monitor our progress via radio. The tunnel descended steeply, the ice walls pressing in close on both sides. Our headlamps created small pools of light in the overwhelming darkness, and every shadow seemed to move and shift at the edge of vision. The whispers grew louder as we descended, resolving into what sounded like chanting or singing, rhythmic and hypnotic. The language was nothing I had ever heard before, not French or the indigenous languages of the region. Something older and stranger that seemed to bypass my ears and resonate directly in my skull. We found the source about 300 feet down. The tunnel opened into a large chamber, maybe 50 feet across, with a ceiling that disappeared into darkness above our lights. The floor was smooth ice, and in the center of the chamber was a structure that should not have existed. It looked like an altar or a shrine, built from stacked rocks and what appeared to be bones, both animal and human. The bones were old, far older than the Gold Rush era miners we had found. Some of them showed tool marks, deliberate cuts and breaks that suggested ritual or ceremony. Around the altar were objects that made my skin crawl. Carved figures made from ice and stone, their forms twisted and inhuman. Symbols etched into the cave walls, spiraling patterns that hurt to look at directly. And everywhere, that sound of whispers, coming from the walls themselves, from the ice beneath our feet, from the darkness above. Sarah began documenting the chamber, taking photographs and measurements, her scientific training overriding the primal fear that was screaming at the rest of us to run. I noticed something that made my blood go cold. The ice around the altar was not solid. It was moving very slowly, bulging and receding like something was breathing beneath it. I pointed this out and Sarah came over to examine it more closely. She placed her hand on the ice and jerked back immediately, her face pale. She said the ice was warm, not hot but noticeably warmer than the surrounding cave. And it was vibrating with a low-frequency pulse that she could feel through her glove. We heard a crack, sharp and loud like a gunshot. A fracture appeared in the ice floor, starting at the altar and racing outward toward the walls. Then another crack, and another spiderweb pattern spreading across the chamber floor. The whispers became a roar. Dozens of voices all speaking at once, and the temperature in the chamber began to rise. Steam or fog started forming, obscuring our vision, and in that white haze I saw shapes moving. Not human shapes, something else, something that had been trapped in the ice and was now breaking free. We ran. Pure animal panic drove us back up that tunnel, slipping on the ice, our headlamps bouncing crazily, the sound of cracking ice following us like something was chasing us through the darkness. Behind us, I could hear the chamber collapsing, tons of ice and rock falling as whatever had been sealed there for God knows how long finally broke free. We made it back to base camp and grabbed our equipment and the 2 team members waiting there. No one argued. We all heard it now. Not just whispers, but something much worse. Footsteps in the tunnels. Heavy and deliberate. Multiple sets of them, coming from different directions like we were being surrounded. And voices, clearer now, speaking in that ancient unknown language, calling out to us or calling to each other, coordinating. We scrambled up the main tunnel toward the entrance shaft, and that is when we found that the 3 mummified miners were no longer in the positions where we had documented them. The first body, the one that had been sitting peacefully against the wall, was now standing in the middle of the tunnel, blocking our path. His frozen eyes were no longer staring at nothing. They were looking directly at us, We tried to move around him, but the corpse moved too, shuffling to stay in our way. His movements were stiff and jerky, like a puppet being controlled by someone who did not quite understand how human bodies worked. His mouth opened and that ancient language came out, the same words we had been hearing in the whispers, and I understood with absolute certainty that the miners had not died of cold or starvation. They had been taken, possessed, used as vessels by something that lived in the deep ice of the cave. The realization was so terrifying I nearly collapsed. These were not mummies. These were prisons, bodies that had trapped whatever evil existed in this place for over a century, keeping it sealed in frozen flesh. And we had disturbed the site, had brought warmth and movement and life into the caves, and that had been enough to wake the things inside. The standing corpse lunged at us with impossible speed. We scattered, two of us managing to get past it and continue toward the entrance. I looked back and saw Sarah grabbed by the mummified miner, his frozen hands closing around her throat. She screamed, and then she stopped screaming, and her body went rigid as something invisible flowed into her, taking control. The two of us who escaped, myself and a graduate student named Tom, climbed that entrance shaft faster than should have been humanly possible. We pulled ourselves out into the night and collapsed in the snow, gasping and shaking. Behind us, from deep in the cave, we could hear sounds that made no sense. Laughter and crying and screaming all mixed together, and underneath it all, the steady crack, crack, crack of ice breaking apart. We ran to our vehicles and drove through the night back to Dawson City. When we reported what happened, when we tried to explain that 3 team members were still in the cave and needed rescue, we were met with skepticism and then with official suppression. A recovery team went into the cave 2 days later. They found no bodies, living or dead. The mummified miners were gone. The altar chamber had collapsed completely. The audio recordings from our equipment, which should have captured everything, were confiscated and classified. Sarah and the other 2 team members were declared missing, presumed dead in a cave collapse. Tom and I were extensively debriefed, which was really just interrogation to make sure we would keep quiet about what we had actually experienced. We were paid well for our silence. Very well. The kind of money that makes you realize this was not the first time something like this had been discovered and covered up. I have spent 16 years trying to make sense of what happened in that ice cave. I have researched the history of the region, looking for clues in indigenous legends and gold rush era records. The Touchwan people have stories about places in the mountains that should never be disturbed, places where ancient spirits sleep in the ice, waiting for someone foolish enough to wake them. The gold rush miners sometimes wrote about finding strange structures in caves, about seeing things in the darkness that drove men mad. There are records of entire mining camps being abandoned suddenly, the miners fleeing in terror from something they refused to name. I think we found one of those places, one of the sealed sites where something from before human history had been trapped and bound by people who understood things we have forgotten. And I think breaking the seal, warming the chamber, documenting the altar, all of it violated some ancient protection that had kept the entities contained. The worst part is that I do not know if we succeeded in escaping or if something came out with us. Tom killed himself 3 years after the expedition. His suicide note talked about hearing whispers in his apartment, about seeing frozen faces in mirrors, about feeling something cold and ancient moving inside his thoughts. I have not had those experiences, not yet, but I feel changed. Sometimes I speak words I do not understand. Sometimes I wake up in places with no memory of how I got there. And sometimes, late at night, I hear ice cracking in my walls, that same sound from the cave, like something is breaking free from inside the structure of reality itself. The official discovery of the ice cave mummies made brief news in 2007. 3 naturally preserved miners from the Klondike Gold Rush, an interesting historical find, now stored in a secure facility where they are being studied by researchers who have no idea what they are really looking at. But I know the truth. Those bodies are prisons, and whatever is inside them is patient and cunning and waiting for another opportunity to escape. I think about Sarah and the others who were taken in that cave. Are they still alive somewhere? Their bodies controlled by ancient entities that are learning to pass as human? Are they walking among us now, spreading to other hosts, growing stronger? The expedition audio logs that were confiscated contained hours of recordings, including the whispers in that unknown language and the sounds of ice cracking from the inside after dark. Someone in the government or military has those recordings. Someone knows what we found, and they chose to suppress it rather than warn people. which tells me they either think it is contained or they know it is too late to do anything about it. I lean toward the latter. The world is full of places like that ice cave, sealed sites where ancient things sleep, waiting for someone to break the ice and let them out. We keep finding them, keep disturbing them, keep paying the price. And the things we release are patient. They have been imprisoned for thousands of years. They can wait a little longer to spread, to grow, to reclaim whatever dominion they once held. The ice cave mummies were not alone when we found them. They were never alone. Something was with them, trapped inside them, whispering in the darkness of that frozen tomb. And now, I fear that same something is loose in the world, wearing human faces, speaking with human voices, spreading like a disease through the population. I hear the whispers sometimes, in crowds, in the distance, calling out in that ancient language I should not understand but somehow do. The horror did not end when we escaped that cave. It followed us out. And it is still growing, still spreading, still whispering its way into our world one frozen soul at a time. Story 4. We investigated Yukon, the throat cave, and recorded this skinwalker legend. I should have known something was terrifying the moment I saw the warning carved into the rock face outside the throat. The symbols were old, older than anything I recognized, and they had been scratched so deep into the stone that whoever made them must have spent days doing it. Days in the freezing Yukon wilderness, desperately trying to warn people away from this place. But I was young and stupid and convinced that every scary legend had a rational explanation. I was a documentary filmmaker back in 1996, and my crew and I had driven 18 hours from Vancouver to Haines Junction to investigate what the locals called the most haunted cave system in North America. The Tlingit people had stories about the throat going back centuries. They said something lived down there, something that could wear your face, something that had been waiting in the darkness since before their ancestors arrived. They called it different names, but the word that kept coming up was skinwalker, though that term usually belonged to Navajo legends further south. Whatever it was, it guarded the throat, and anyone who went deep enough into those caves either never came back or came back wrong. Changed. Not themselves anymore. We arrived at the site on October 7th, just as the first real cold snap was settling over the territory. The entrance to the throat sat at the base of a limestone cliff, about 40 miles northeast of Haines Junction, accessible only by logging roads that had not been maintained in years. Our van bottomed out 3 times getting there. My sound guy, Marcus, kept joking that the road itself was trying to keep us away, but his laugh sounded nervous even then. The cave opening was maybe 6 feet across, perfectly circular, and when you looked into it, you could not see anything beyond the first few feet. Just pure, absolute darkness that seemed to swallow our flashlight beams. The air coming out of that opening was wrong. It was not cold like you would expect from a cave in October. It was warm and wet and smelled like something had been rotting down there for a very long time. Sarah, our camera operator, filmed the entrance for a few minutes, and when she checked her viewfinder, she went quiet. She showed me the footage later that first day, and I saw what had unsettled her. In the playback, the darkness inside the throat seemed to move, to pulse like something breathing. We set up our base camp about 100 yards from the entrance. 3 tents, equipment cases, enough food for 5 days. The plan was simple. Spend the first day surveying the entrance and upper chambers, then do a deep exploration on day 2 with full recording equipment, climbing gear, everything we needed to document whatever was down there. That first night, none of us slept well. The forest around us was completely silent. No birds, no insects, no wind in the trees. Just silence so heavy it felt like pressure against your eardrums. Around 2 in the morning, I heard something moving outside my tent. Footsteps, but they were not right. They came in sets of 4, like someone walking on all 4s, but the rhythm was too fast, too scrambling. I lay in my sleeping bag, frozen, listening as whatever it was circled our camp 3 times before moving off toward the throat. In the morning, we found tracks in the frost. They started as bare human footprints near the tree line, changed into something with claws halfway to our camp, then disappeared entirely about 10 feet from the cave entrance, like whatever made them had simply vanished into the air. Marcus wanted to leave right then. He was the only one of us who had actually listened to the warnings from the Tlingit elder we had interviewed in Haines Junction. The old man, his name was Thomas, had refused to tell us exactly where the throat was located. He said the cave was sacred and forbidden, that the thing living inside it was not an animal or a spirit, but something older, something that existed in the spaces between what we call real and unreal. He said it could take your shape, your voice, your memories, and that once it started mimicking you, the real you was already gone. We had dismissed it as superstition, the kind of creepy folklore that would make great content for our documentary. Now, standing in the cold morning light looking at those impossible tracks, that dismissal felt like the most terrifying mistake we had ever made. We entered the throat at 10:30 on the morning of October 8th. Sarah went first with the primary camera. I followed with the backup and my field recorder. Marcus came last with the lighting rig and safety rope. The entrance tunnel descended at a steep angle, the walls so smooth they looked almost polished. Our lights created strange shadows that seemed to move independently from us, stretching and contracting in ways that made my eyes hurt. About 50 feet down, the tunnel opened into a larger chamber, maybe 30 feet across. The ceiling was covered in those same symbols we had seen outside, hundreds of them, carved in overlapping patterns that made you dizzy if you looked too long. In the center of the chamber was a hole, perfectly circular, about 8 feet in diameter, dropping straight down into darkness so complete our lights could not find the bottom. The locals called this the actual throat, the place where the cave swallowed you. The air rising from it carried that same wrong warmth, and now I could identify part of the smell. Not rot exactly, but something like it. Something organic and alive and fundamentally other. Sarah set up her camera on a tripod, pointing down into the throat. We dropped a glow stick to see how deep it went. We watched it fall for 7 seconds before it disappeared, not because it hit bottom, but because the darkness consumed its light. Marcus checked his altimeter and went pale. He showed me the reading. We were only 80 feet below ground level, but his equipment was registering pressure changes like we were at several thousand feet of depth. The numbers made no sense. Nothing about this place made sense. I should have called it there. Should have packed up our gear and driven back to civilization and never looked back. But I was thinking about the documentary, about the footage, about how this was the most genuinely creepy location I had ever encountered. I was thinking about everything except the warnings. I suggested we rappel down into the throat, just far enough to get some footage of what was below. Sarah agreed immediately. Marcus looked at both of us like we had lost our minds, but eventually, he nodded. We secured our rope to a rock formation and prepared for descent. I went first this time. The descent was terrifying from the moment I dropped below the edge. The walls of the throat were covered in a substance that looked like calcified bone, smooth and pale and slightly luminescent in my headlamp. This beam. About 20 feet down, I noticed something that made my blood freeze. There were handprints pressed into the walls, dozens of them, as if people had been climbing or falling and desperately trying to grab onto anything to stop their descent. The prints were small and large, recent and ancient, layered over each other in a chaotic pattern that suggested many people had died in this shaft. Some of the prints were still wet. I called up to Sarah and Marcus, my voice echoing strangely, and told them what I was seeing. Sarah's response came back distorted, like she was speaking through water. She said something about the camera behaving strangely, the footage glitching, showing things that were not there when she looked with her naked eye. Then she stopped talking. I called up again, no response. I started climbing back up, hand over hand, my heart hammering so hard I thought I might pass out. When I reached the chamber, Sarah and Marcus were gone. Their equipment was still there. Sarah's camera was still recording, still pointing into the throat. Marcus' lighting rig was still running. But they had vanished, completely and without a sound. I screamed their names. The echo came back wrong. Syllables reversed, voices overlapping in ways that sounded like multiple people screaming at once. Then I heard Sarah's voice behind me, coming from deeper in the cave system, from a tunnel I had not noticed before. She was calling my name, asking why I had left them, saying she was scared and needed help. But her voice was not quite right. The pitch was perfect. The words were perfect, but there was no emotion behind them. It sounded like someone doing an impression of Sarah, hitting all the technical notes but missing the essential humanity underneath. I knew with absolute certainty that whatever was calling to me was not Sarah. The real Sarah was gone. The thing down here had taken her. And now I was wearing her voice like a costume, trying to lure me deeper. I grabbed Sarah's camera and ran, not back toward the entrance, because something was blocking that path now. Something large and wrong that I only glimpsed in my peripheral vision before my brain refused to process what I was seeing. I ran deeper into the cave system, into tunnels that branched and twisted, into chambers filled with more of those bone-like calcifications, into spaces where the darkness felt alive and hungry. Behind me, I could hear footsteps. Sometimes they sounded human, sometimes they sounded like something massive dragging itself across stone, and sometimes they sounded like nothing I could describe. Rhythms and impacts that did not match any form of locomotion I understood. The thing was following me, and it was learning. Every few minutes, it would call out in different voices. Sarah's voice, Marcus's voice, my own voice, which was the most disturbing, hearing myself screaming for help from somewhere behind me in the darkness. I lost track of time. The cave seemed to go on forever, chambers connecting to chambers, tunnels doubling back on themselves. My battery started dying, first the headlamp, then my backup flashlight, until I was navigating by the faint glow of the camera's LCD screen, which was still somehow recording even though its battery indicator had shown empty for the last hour. The footage on that screen was nightmare fuel. Every time I glanced at it, I saw things in the background of the shot that were not there when I looked with my own eyes. Figures standing in the tunnels behind me, faces pressed against the cave walls, something massive and pale crawling across the ceiling, its proportions all wrong. Too many limbs, too many joints. The camera was recording things I could not see, things my brain was protecting me from perceiving directly. I realized this cave was not just a physical space. It existed partially in some other dimension, some other layer of reality, and the camera was capturing both versions simultaneously. I found a chamber that felt different from the others, safer somehow, though I could not explain why. The walls were covered in more recent markings, not the ancient symbols but words carved in English and French and what looked like Russian. Names and dates going back decades. Warnings. Most of them said the same thing in different languages. It wears us. It becomes us. Do not let it speak with your voice. At the far end of the chamber was a pile of equipment. Old cameras, flashlights, climbing gear, all of it covered in that pale calcification, slowly being absorbed into the cave itself. I recognized some of the camera models. A documentary crew from the 70s had disappeared up here. Before that, a geological survey team in the 40s. Before that, who knows how far back the disappearances went. All of them had left their gear behind in this chamber, their final stopping point before whatever happened next. I added Sarah's camera to the pile, still recording, still documenting the horror even though no one would ever watch the footage. Then I heard my own voice again, closer this time, just outside the chamber. It was me, perfectly me, calling out that I had found the exit, that I needed help because I was hurt. The voice was coming from the tunnel I had entered through. I pressed myself against the far wall and waited. Footsteps approached, then I saw it. It looked exactly like me. Same clothes, same face, same mannerisms. It walked into the chamber and looked around, and when its eyes found where I was hiding, it smiled. Not a human smile, something that had studied human expressions but did not understand the emotion behind them. It spoke with my voice and said, "I have been waiting for you. We are going to leave together now. You are going to show me the world outside." I understood then what had happened to all the others. The thing did not just kill you. It replaced you. It took your form and your memories and walked back out into the world wearing your life like a suit. How many of these things were out there now? Living in houses, holding jobs, raising families, perfectly mimicking humanity while something ancient and alien puppeted them from within. I ran again. There was another tunnel, narrower, descending sharply. The thing that wore my face followed. I could hear it moving faster now, no longer bothering to maintain human locomotion. Dropping to all fours, its joints bending in directions that made wet cracking sounds. The tunnel became so narrow I had to crawl. The stones scraped my back and chest. Behind me, the thing was getting closer. I could hear it breathing, except the breathing had too many parts, too many intakes and exhales, like multiple sets of lungs operating in sequence. Then the tunnel opened into another chamber, and I fell. I dropped about 15 feet into water. Cold, dark water that filled a pool at least 30 feet across. I surfaced, gasping, and realized this chamber had no other exits. I had trapped myself. Above me, at the tunnel opening, the thing appeared. It crouched there, looking down at me with my own face, and then it started changing. The transformation was the most terrifying thing I have ever witnessed. Its bones cracked and reformed. Its skin split and healed and split again. Features I recognized from Sarah and Marcus bubbled up through my stolen face and then sank back down. It was showing me what it really was, this amalgamation of everyone it had ever consumed. All their identities layered over some central form that my mind kept refusing to fully perceive. It dropped into the water with me. I dove deep, swimming blindly in the freezing darkness, my lungs burning. When I surfaced on the far side of the pool, I found a gap in the wall, barely wide enough to squeeze through. I pulled myself into it, ignoring the pain as the stone tore my clothes and skin. The gap led to another tunnel, this one angling upward. I crawled on my belly, inches at a time, for what felt like hours. Behind me, I could hear the thing trying to follow, but it was too large for this passage, whatever its true size was. It screamed with a dozen voices, all the people it had taken, all of them crying out in rage and hunger. The tunnel eventually widened. I could stand. I could run again, and then I saw light. Real light, daylight, filtering down from above. I climbed toward it, my hands bleeding, my body wrecked with exhaustion. I emerged from a crack in the hillside about 2 miles from where we had originally entered the throat. It was dark outside, stars overhead, frost on the ground. I had been underground for 7 hours. Our van was gone. So were all our supplies. The only thing left at our camp was a note, written in my handwriting on a page torn from my journal. It said, "Went for help. Be back soon." But I had not written it. The thing had written it, using my hand, my writing style, preparing its escape route. I walked to the nearest road and eventually flagged down a logging truck. The driver looked at me strangely when I told him what happened. He said 2 people matching Sarah and Marcus' descriptions had come through Haynes Junction yesterday, saying their friend had gotten injured in the cave and they needed to get him to a hospital in Whitehorse. They had taken my van and driven south. The driver said they seemed fine, just concerned. Totally normal. I never found Sarah or Marcus. Search and rescue went into the throat but only explored the first few chambers before declaring it too dangerous. They found no bodies, no equipment, no evidence we had ever been there beyond some rope marks on the rocks. Our footage was never recovered. The camera I left in that deep chamber is probably still recording, documenting the darkness, slowly becoming part of the cave. 6 months later, I saw Marcus in Vancouver. I was at a coffee shop and he walked past the window. Same walk, same clothes, same face. He did not see me. Or maybe he did and chose not to acknowledge me because I was the one piece of his stolen life that did not fit. I have spent years trying to understand what we found in the throat. The closest I have come is this. There are places where the world is thin, where something from outside can reach through. The Tlingit knew this. They marked those places as forbidden. They tried to keep the borders secure. We ignored the warnings and opened the door. And now there are things walking around wearing human faces, living human lives, waiting. I still do not sleep well. Every face I see, I wonder if it is real or if something is puppeting it from within. Every time I hear my own voice, I question if I am really the one speaking. Because here's the terrifying truth I have never told anyone until now. I do not remember how I got out of that final tunnel. I remember crawling toward the light, and then nothing until I was standing outside, bleeding and cold. What if I did not make it out? What if I'm the thing that escaped, wearing my memories, telling my story, perfectly mimicking the man I used to be? What if the real me is still down there in the darkness, and I am the nightmare that came back? I look at my hands sometimes and they feel wrong, like they belong to someone else. I catch my reflection in the face looking back seems like a mask. The horror is not knowing. The horror is that I might never know. And if you ever hear about a cave called the Throat, if you ever see those warnings carved in stone, do not investigate. Do not film it. Do not go inside, because something is waiting down there in the darkness, something that has been hungry for a very long time. And it is still learning how to be human. Story 5. Frozen Solid. The Mountie who was found standing up. The first thing that haunted me about finding Officer Thomas Bradshaw was not that he was dead, but that his eyes were still open, staring at something in the trees that I could not see. And when I got close enough, I swear I heard the faint sound of bells jingling in the distance. My name is William Hatcher, and in March of 1955 I was a tracker and guide working out of Fort Nelson in northern British Columbia. I had spent 20 years in the bush, helping search parties locate missing persons, guiding hunters, mapping remote territories that even most locals refused to enter. I thought I had seen every way the wilderness could kill a man. Exposure, falls, Animal attacks, starvation. All of it brutal, all of it explainable. What I found that day in the pine grove defied every natural law I understood. Officer Thomas Bradshaw had been missing for 11 days when the Royal Canadian Mounted Police hired me to join the search. He had been on routine patrol, checking trappers' cabins along the 100-mile stretch between Fort Nelson and the Yukon border. His last radio contact had been normal, reporting clear weather and no incidents. Then nothing. His truck was found abandoned on a logging road 30 miles from his last known position. Engine still running, door hanging open, his rifle still locked in the rack. The search had been going on for over a week by the time they brought me in. Dozens of volunteers, other RCMP officers, even a helicopter when weather permitted. They had found nothing. No tracks, no signs of struggle, no indication of where Bradshaw might have gone or why he would have left his vehicle in the middle of nowhere with the engine running. I met with the search coordinator, a staff sergeant named Morrison who looked like he had not slept in days. He showed me maps, pointed out where search teams had already covered, and handed me Bradshaw's patrol logbook that had been found in his truck. The last several entries were routine, boring even. Mileage, locations checked, notes about trail conditions. Nothing unusual until I reached the final entry, written in handwriting that looked rushed and shaky. The words made my skin crawl. It is following me. It sounds like jingling bells. That was it. No further explanation. No description. Just that single cryptic sentence followed by blank pages. Morrison asked me what I thought it meant. I told him I had no idea. But something about those words triggered a memory. A story I had heard years ago from an old Dean elder about something that hunted in the deep bush during winter. Something that announced itself with the sound of bells or chains rattling in the frozen air. I pushed the memory aside and focused on the search. I started at Bradshaw's truck and worked outward in a grid pattern, looking for any sign of passage. The ground was frozen solid, covered in a thin layer of snow that had been trampled by dozens of searchers. Finding a clear track was nearly impossible. But on the third day, I found something. About 2 miles east of where the truck had been abandoned, I discovered a single boot print in a patch of soft ground near a frozen creek. It was fresh, maybe a few days old, and it matched the standard RCMP issue boots that Bradshaw would have been wearing. The print was deep, pressed hard into the earth as if he had been running or stumbling. I followed the direction it pointed and found another print 50 yards further, then another. The tracks led me away from the main search area, into denser forest where the pine trees grew so close together that moving between them required squeezing through gaps and pushing aside branches. The temperature was dropping as the sun lowered, that brutal cold that comes on fast in northern BC during March, when winter refuses to release its grip and the nights can still kill you in hours. I marked my trail and kept following the prints. They were erratic now, zigzagging between trees, doubling back on themselves, the pattern of someone who was lost or disoriented or running from something. And then I started noticing other things. Broken branches at head height, as if something tall had passed through. Scratches in the tree bark, deep gouges that looked fresh. And strangest of all, I began to hear it. Bells, faint and distant, a soft jingling that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. At first I thought it was my imagination, my mind playing tricks after reading Bradshaw's journal entry. But the sound persisted, growing slightly louder as I moved deeper into the forest. It was not the cheerful sound of sleigh bells or wind chimes. It was discordant, unsettling, notes that did not quite harmonize, hanging in the cold air like a warning. The forest around me had gone completely silent. No birds, no wind, no small animals rustling in the underbrush. Just that eerie jingling and the crunch of my boots in the snow and the sound of my own breathing, which had gotten faster and shallower as an instinctive fear began to build in my chest. I found him an hour before sunset, standing in a small clearing surrounded by old-growth pine trees. Officer Thomas Bradshaw was frozen completely solid, his body locked in a standing position as if he had simply stopped walking and never moved again. He was facing away from me, looking deeper into the forest, his arms hanging at his sides, one hand slightly raised as if reaching for something. His RCMP uniform was intact, no visible damage, no blood, no signs of violence. He was just standing there, perfectly preserved in the sub-zero temperature, transformed into a statue of ice and flesh. I approached slowly, my rifle raised despite knowing it was too late to help him. The frozen ground crunched under my feet. each step echoing through the silent trees. As I got closer, I could see the frost coating his uniform, ice crystals that had formed in his hair and eyebrows, the unnatural stillness of a human body that had become part of the winter landscape. When I finally walked around to see his face, my hand started shaking so badly I nearly dropped my rifle. His eyes were open, staring straight ahead with an expression of absolute terror frozen on his features. His mouth was open too, locked in what might have been a scream or a gasp, lips pulled back from his teeth. But it was not just the expression that disturbed me. It was what I saw in his eyes, in the way they were focused on something specific in the trees ahead, tracking something that I could not see. I followed his gaze into the forest, scanning the darkness between the pines, looking for whatever had captured his attention in those final moments. The light was fading fast now, shadows stretching and merging, making it difficult to distinguish shapes. And then the jingling sound grew suddenly louder, clear and distinct, coming from somewhere directly ahead of where Bradshaw was staring. I raised my rifle and clicked off the safety, my heart hammering in my chest. The sound was moving, circling around the clearing, maintaining a constant distance. It was rhythmic, deliberate, not the random noise of something being blown by wind or animal movement. Whatever was making that sound was doing it intentionally, announcing its presence. I saw movement between the trees, a shadow that was darker than the surrounding darkness, tall and thin and moving with a fluid grace that seemed wrong somehow. It paused at the edge of the clearing, just barely visible, and I felt its attention shift to me. The temperature seemed to drop even further, cold so intense it burned my exposed skin and made my lungs ache. The jingling stopped abruptly, replaced by complete silence that was somehow worse. I stood there for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds, my rifle pointed at that dark shape, waiting for it to move or attack or do something I could understand. Then it simply faded back into the forest, dissolving into the shadows as if it had never been there at all. I did not wait around to see if it would return. I marked Bradshaw, its location with surveyor, its tape and got the hell out of that forest, moving as fast as I could in the failing light, constantly looking over my shoulder, that sense of being watched following me the entire way back to civilization. The recovery team went in the next morning with a dozen men and plenty of daylight. They found Bradshaw exactly where I had left him, still standing, still frozen solid. It took them hours to carefully extract his body from that position, and even then he remained locked in that standing pose. The official report said he died of exposure, that he had somehow gotten lost and wandered until hypothermia set in and killed him. But that did not explain why he was standing upright. Hypothermia victims curl up, seeking warmth, making themselves small. They do not freeze while standing at attention, staring at something in the trees. And it definitely did not explain what was found during the autopsy. The coroner was a friend of mine, a man named Dr. Patterson who had performed hundreds of examinations on bodies recovered from the wilderness. He called me 3 days after Bradshaw's body was brought in, asked me to come to his office, said there was something I needed to see that was not going in any official report. Bradshaw's body had thawed by then, and Patterson had completed his examination. The cause of death was listed as hypothermia, as expected. But Patterson showed me photographs of something else. On Bradshaw's back, visible through tears in his uniform, were scratches. Deep gouges in the flesh, 3 parallel lines that ran from his shoulders down to his lower back. The wounds had frozen before they could bleed much, preserving them in horrifying detail. Patterson, his hands were shaking as he showed me the measurements. The scratches were spaced too far apart to be from any animal native to British Columbia. The depth and angle suggested something had raked its claws down Bradshaw's back while he was standing upright, something tall enough to reach from above and behind. And the wounds showed signs of having been inflicted shortly before death, meaning Bradshaw had been conscious when it happened, aware and terrified as something marked him. I asked Patterson if he was going to include this in his report. He looked at me with exhausted eyes and said no. That Morrison had already made it clear the official story was exposure and hypothermia, that there would be no mention of unexplained injuries or anomalous circumstances. Bradshaw's family would be told he got lost in the bush and froze to death, a tragic accident but nothing more. I went back to that clearing once more, 2 weeks later, after the search had ended and everyone had gone home. I brought a camera and measuring tape, documented everything I could find. The scratches in the tree bark were still there, too high for any person to have made without a ladder. I found tracks in the snow that had survived the thaw, prints that were almost human but elongated and too large, with claw marks at the toe points. And I found something else that made me understand why Bradshaw had been so terrified in his final moments. Hanging from a low branch near where he had been standing was a collection of small bells, the kind that might hang on a harness or be used as decoration. They were old, tarnished, tied together with what looked like sinew or dried tendon. When the wind caught them, they made that same discordant jingling sound I had heard, that eerie announcement that something was approaching. I took the bells with me, cut them down, and wrapped them carefully before hiking back out. I still have them, locked in a box in my basement, and sometimes late at night when I cannot sleep I take them out and listen to that sound, trying to understand what it means, what message was being sent. The old Dean elder I had remembered, the one who told stories about things that hunted in winter. I found him living on a reserve outside Fort Nelson. His name was Joseph, and he was nearly 90 years old, his face mapped with wrinkles and his eyes clouded with age. I told him what I had found, described everything in detail.
I stood there as if rooted to the floor, something cracking slowly inside my chest, not from the insult, no. From the realization that my son didn't even flinch. "Mom, let's talk later," Nathan whispered, eyes turned away, as if I were a stain on the linen. I inhaled deeper than my nerves allowed and smiled the way women my age do when dignity is all they have left and the heart is collapsing inside. "Of course, Nathan. Later is fine." Megan lifted her chin, triumphant, her friends leaning in as if I'd already left. But I stood there. I saw every smirk, every whisper. And that's when I noticed her father's face, drained of color, frozen, staring at me as though he'd seen a ghost. "Nora Collins," he breathed, and the silence fell so sharply I felt the air turn cold around us. The moment her father said my name, the terrace shifted. It felt like the ocean breeze itself paused, listening. Megan's friends stopped laughing mid-sip. One woman even lowered her phone like she was afraid to capture what came next. Her father stepped closer, staring as though the years rearranged themselves in front of him. "You're the Nora Collins? West Point commercial, Nora Collins?" His voice cracked on the second repetition. I lifted my chin. Last time I checked. It was almost comical, the way every mocking smile dissolved at once. But there was nothing funny about humiliation, about being stripped down to livestock by the woman who was about to marry my son. I kept my posture, straight and calm, even though inside, something old and tired and wounded was trembling for balance. Megan's face tightened. "Dad, what's the problem?" "She's just, he snapped, spinning toward her. "Do you understand whose name you've been throwing around?" The entire bridal party murmured. Even Nathan finally turned, confusion crossing his face like he was waking from a long sleep. I could have gloated. I could have delivered a long, rehearsed speech about respect and gratitude. But I didn't. Women my age don't get power by yelling. Our strength is quieter, sharper. It arrives in moments like this, unexpected, uninvited, undeniable. I simply said, "You should have taught your daughter manners, Mr. Austin." No anger, no venom, just truth. His mouth opened, then shut again. Megan grabbed his arm, suddenly pale. "Dad, why are you acting like she's the president or something?" He looked at her the way a man looks at a building he designed and suddenly realizes he measured wrong. "Because if Nora Collins is who I think she is, she owns the company that signs every one of our paychecks." Silence again. A slow, stunned silence that slid across the terrace like a shadow. Nathan stepped toward me. "Mom, why didn't you say anything?" I didn't look at him. Couldn't. Not when he'd stood there letting them call me names. Not when he'd pretended he didn't hear. Instead I answered, "Because my value shouldn't depend on a job title. You should respect me because I raised you. Not because of what I own." His face fell. I could see the guilt land like a stone on his shoulders, but it was too late. Some things can't be undone with a single look of regret. Megan tried to laugh, but the sound came out brittle. "Well, okay, maybe we got off on the wrong foot. Let's just forget it. Forget it. People always want to forget the things they did, to you, at you, about you. They never want to forget when the consequences arrive." I stepped forward just enough to reclaim my space. "No, we're not forgetting anything." Her jaw clenched. "What do you want, then?" The ocean wind lifted my hair. I didn't raise my voice, didn't move dramatically, didn't do anything but speak the truth every woman eventually learns to say. I want dignity, and starting today, I'll take it. Someone gasped. Megan's bracelet clinked loudly against her glass. Her father wiped his forehead like the California sun suddenly felt unforgiving. Then I delivered the sentence that would change the whole trajectory of the Austin family. We will meet Monday morning. 9 a.m. All of you. Anyone who feels entitled to insult the woman who owns the business they depend on. Megan froze. Her friends froze. Nathan whispered, "Mom, please." But I was already turning away, my heels clicking against the stone floor, my heartbeat calm for the first time in years. I wasn't leaving in shame. I wasn't shrinking. I was standing tall in the dress they mocked, the body they dismissed, the life they underestimated.
Story 6. Dempster Highway, Lighthouse, Alien Abduction in the Tundra. I lost 3 hours of my life on the Dempster Highway, and I still cannot explain what happened to me in that terrifying darkness. My name is Robert Chen. I am 51 years old, and I drive long-haul trucks across Alaska and northern Canada. I have been doing this job for 23 years, and I have seen some strange things on these lonely roads. Weird weather, wildlife acting unusual, the northern lights doing things that do not make sense. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for what I encountered on that desolate stretch of highway last October. This is the most disturbing true story I have ever lived through, and I need to tell someone before the fear drives me completely insane. The Dempster Highway runs from the Yukon down through some of the most isolated tundra in North America. 400 miles of gravel road, barely maintained, cutting through wilderness where you could drive for hours without seeing another human being. Most truckers hate it. The road tears up your vehicle, the weather can turn deadly in minutes, and if you break down out there, help might be days away. But the pay is good, and I have always been comfortable with solitude. Or at least I was, until that night. I left Inuvik on October 19th, heading south with a load of construction equipment. The sun sets early that far north in October, and by 4 in the afternoon I was driving through complete darkness. No moon, no stars, just my headlights cutting through the black, illuminating endless gravel and stunted trees. The radio had died about an hour into the drive, nothing but static on every station. Not unusual up there. I just drove in silence, watching the road, counting the miles. That was when I saw the light. At first I thought it was another truck coming toward me, but the light was wrong. Too bright, too high off the ground. And it was not moving like a vehicle. It pulsed, slow and rhythmic, like a heartbeat made of pure white light. It appeared on the horizon directly ahead of me, maybe 5 miles out, and my first thought was lighthouse, which made no sense. There was no ocean anywhere near here. No lakes big enough to need a lighthouse. But that is what it looked like. A massive beam of light rotating slowly, sweeping across the tundra, impossibly bright against the darkness. I slowed down, confused, trying to figure out what I was seeing. The light kept pulsing, kept rotating, and as I got closer I realized it was not on the ground. It was hovering maybe 200 feet in the air, just floating there above the empty highway. Every instinct told me to turn around, to get off this road and away from whatever that thing was. But there was nowhere to turn. The Dempster is narrow, and the ground on either side is soft tundra that would swallow my truck in seconds. I had no choice but to keep driving forward. The light grew brighter as I approached, painfully bright. I squinted against it, my eyes watering, and that is when I noticed the sound. A low humming, so deep I felt it more than heard it, vibrating through the steering wheel and into my bones. It made my teeth ache, made my head feel strange and disconnected, like I was underwater. I should have stopped the truck, should have pulled over and waited for whatever this was to pass. But I could not. My hands would not obey me. I just kept driving, straight toward that pulsing light, while every part of my brain screamed at me to stop. The beam swept over my truck, and everything went white. Not just bright white, pure, absolute whiteness that erased everything. I could not see the road, could not see my dashboard, could not see my own hands on the steering wheel. Just endless, burning white light that seemed to pour into my skull through my eyes. And then I was somewhere else. I do not remember the transition. 1 second I was in my truck. The next I was standing on the highway in the freezing cold, my engine silent, the white light gone. I looked around frantically, trying to understand what had just happened. My truck was stopped at an angle across the road, the driver, his door hanging open. The headlights were off, The engine was off, and according to my watch, it was 7:15. 3 hours had passed. I had no memory of those 3 hours. Nothing, just a blank space in my mind where time should have been. The last thing I remembered clearly was that white light, and then suddenly I was standing on the highway with no idea how I got there. My heart was pounding so hard it hurt. My hands were shaking. I climbed back into the truck and tried to start the engine, but nothing happened. Dead. Completely dead. The battery, the alternator, everything. Like something had drained all the power right out of the vehicle. I grabbed my flashlight and got out to check the engine, and that is when I saw them. Footprints in the frost on the ground around my truck. Not my footprints. These were different. Longer, narrower, almost human but not quite right. And there were dozens of them, circling my truck, leading off into the darkness in both directions. I swept my flashlight across the tundra, and my blood turned to ice. There were figures standing out there in the dark. Tall, impossibly tall, maybe 8 or 9 feet high. Their bodies were thin, too thin, like they were stretched out wrong. I could not see details. They were just dark silhouettes against the slightly lighter sky, but I could feel them watching me. I do not know how long I stood there, frozen, staring at those shapes. It might have been seconds. It might have been minutes. Time felt broken, wrong, like I was moving through something thicker than air. Then one of them moved. It glided toward me, not walking but floating, its feet not quite touching the ground. As it got closer, I could see more details, and I wished to God I could not. Its head was too large for its body, smooth and featureless except for dark spots where eyes should be. Its arms hung down past its knees, and its fingers were long and skeletal. I tried to run. My legs would not work. I tried to scream. No sound came out. I just stood there, paralyzed, as this thing came closer and closer. It stopped about 10 feet away from me. We stared at each other, and I felt something pushing into my mind. Not words, not thoughts, just a presence, cold and alien and wrong, probing through my memories like fingers rifling through papers. Images flashed through my head. The inside of something curved and metallic. Lights that moved in patterns I could not follow. A table or platform that I was lying on. Shapes moving around me. Pain. Sharp, precise pain in my arms and legs and neck. Then the presence withdrew, and I could move again. The figure turned and glided back into the darkness, and all the other shapes followed it, moving in perfect unison. Within seconds they had disappeared into the night, and I was alone on the highway with my dead truck and 3 missing hours and the absolute certainty that something terrible had been done to me. I do not remember much of what happened next. I must have flagged down another truck eventually, because I woke up in the hospital in Dawson City 2 days later. They said I was suffering from severe hypothermia and exposure, that I had been found unconscious beside my truck, which had apparently just run out of gas. Everything else I remembered was hallucination brought on by the cold and isolation. But I know what I saw. I know what happened to me. And I have the proof. There are marks on my body that were not there before. Small, circular scars on both arms and on the back of my neck. Perfectly symmetrical. The doctors could not explain them. They did blood tests, scans, everything. All normal, they said. Nothing wrong with me at all. Except I cannot sleep anymore. Every time I close my eyes, I see that pulsing white light. I hear that deep humming sound. And I remember things that I should not remember. Fragments of those missing 3 hours, coming back in pieces like a shattered mirror slowly reassembling itself. I remember being inside something. A room with curved walls that glowed with soft light. I remember being unable to move, my body frozen on a cold metal surface. I remember the tall figures standing around me, their long fingers touching my skin, and the pain. Dear God, the pain. And I remember voices, not out loud, inside my head, telling me things I cannot repeat, showing me images of places that do not exist on Earth, explaining things about time and space and reality that human minds are not meant to understand. I researched it afterwards, once I was well enough to use a computer. I found dozens of reports from other drivers on the Dempster Highway. They all described the same thing, a pulsating light like a lighthouse appearing out of nowhere. Lost time, strange figures, and afterwards, marks on their bodies and memories they could not explain. Some of them tried to go back, to find answers, to confront whatever it was. None of them returned. The official explanation is always the same. Hallucinations from isolation and cold. Mass hysteria. Northern lights causing optical illusions. The government will not investigate. The authorities will not acknowledge that anything unusual happens on that highway. But the locals know. They call it the lighthouse, and they warn people not to drive the Dempster alone after dark. They say something lives out there on the tundra, something that has been there longer than humans have existed, and it takes people sometimes. Studies them, and most of the time, it puts them back, but not always the same as they were before. I quit long-haul trucking 3 weeks ago. I cannot do it anymore. Cannot face those dark highways and empty roads where anything might be waiting. I sleep with all the lights on in my apartment. I check the locks 10 times before bed, and I keep seeing those figures in my peripheral vision, standing at the edge of parking lots, watching from across streets, always just out of clear sight. My wife thinks I need therapy. My friends think I had a breakdown. Maybe they are right. Maybe I'm going crazy. But I know what happened to me out there on the Dempster Highway. I was taken, I was studied, and I was returned, but something came back with me. I can feel it sometimes, in my head, that cold alien presence. Watching through my eyes, learning, waiting. Last night I woke up at 3 a.m. to find myself standing in my kitchen with no memory of getting out of bed. My hands were covered in frost even though the apartment was warm. And written on the window in condensation were symbols I have never seen before but somehow understood. They translate to, "We are coming back." I do not know what that means. I do not know when they will return, but I can feel it now, every night when the darkness comes. That pulsing white light, somewhere beyond the horizon, calling to me. And I am terrified that one night, I will answer. Story 7. Watcher at the Window. The Old Loggers Hotel in Watson Lake. I will never forget the sound of fingernails tapping on glass from the outside of a second-floor window, and the terrifying moment I realized there was no fire escape, no ledge, nothing out there but a 40-foot drop to frozen ground. It was January 12, 2003, and I was spending my first night in room 7 of the Old Loggers Hotel in Watson Lake, a tiny town in the Yukon territory where the Alaska Highway cuts through endless wilderness. I was a truck driver back then, hauling freight between Alaska and the lower 48, and the Old Loggers Hotel was a regular stop for drivers like me who needed a warm bed and a hot meal in the middle of nowhere. The hotel had been standing since 1942, built to house the workers constructing the Alaska Highway during World War II. It was a 2-story wooden building that creaked and groaned in the wind, with narrow hallways that smelled like old cigarettes and pine cleaner, and a reputation for being one of the most haunted places in northern Canada. Every driver knew the stories about Room 7, about the lonely lumberjack who appeared at the window on cold winter nights, tapping on the glass and begging to be let in from the darkness. I had laughed at those stories. I had stayed at the Old Loggers Hotel dozens of times over the years, always requesting Room 7 just to prove the legends were nothing but creepy nonsense designed to entertain bored truckers. I had never seen anything unusual, never heard anything that could not be explained by an old building settling or wind rattling the windows. But that night was different. The temperature had dropped to 35 below zero, cold enough that your breath froze in the air and your exposed skin went numb in seconds. The kind of cold that killed you if you stayed outside too long. The kind of cold that made you understand why the old-timers talked about the Yukon winter like it was a living thing with teeth. I checked into the hotel around 9 at night after 14 hours on the road. The clerk, an older woman named Margaret who had worked there for 20 years, gave me a strange look when I asked for Room 7. She told me it was available but suggested I might prefer a different room. When I insisted, she handed me the key with a warning that made my skin prickle despite the warmth of the lobby. She said if I heard tapping on the window, I should not look and I should definitely not open it, no matter how much the voice outside begged me to let him in from the cold. Room 7 was at the end of the second-floor hallway, the last door on the left. The room was small and sparse, just a single bed, a nightstand, a dresser, and one large window that looked out over the back of the hotel toward the forest. The window was old, single-pane glass in a wooden frame that did not quite seal properly, letting in thin streams of freezing air that made the curtains move slightly even when the window was closed. I dropped my bag on the bed and went to check the view. Outside, there was nothing but darkness and snow, the forest pressing in close to the building, and beyond that, the vast empty wilderness of the Yukon stretching for hundreds of miles in every direction. The isolation was absolute. If something happened out here, if you needed help, you were on your own. The nearest real town was hours away. I pulled the curtains closed, turned on the television for some background noise, and tried to settle in for the night. But I could not shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something outside in that frozen darkness was paying very close attention to Room 7. Around midnight, I was lying in bed half asleep when I heard it for the first time. A soft tapping sound, rhythmic and deliberate, tap, 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 coming from the direction of the window. I opened my eyes and stared at the curtains. The tapping continued, patient and insistent, tap, 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 like someone knocking politely and waiting for an answer. I told myself it was ice falling from the roof or a branch blown against the glass by the wind. But the sound was too regular, too purposeful. It was the sound of knuckles or fingernails rapping on glass. The unmistakable sound of someone asking for attention. The room was freezing now, colder than it should have been even with the poorly sealed window. I could see my breath forming clouds in the air. The tapping grew slightly louder, more urgent, tap, 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 tap. And I realized it was moving, starting at one corner of the window and traveling across the glass like someone was dragging their hand along the surface from outside. My heart was pounding. Every instinct screamed at me to stay in bed, to ignore it, to remember Margaret's warning. But curiosity is a terrible thing. I had to know what was making that sound. I got out of bed and crossed the room, my bare feet silent on the cold floor. The tapping stopped the moment I moved, like whatever was out there knew I was coming and was waiting to see what I would do. I reached for the curtains, my hand shaking, and pulled them aside just enough to look out. For a moment, I saw nothing but my own reflection in the dark glass and the faint glow of the room behind me. Then my eyes adjusted to the darkness outside, and I saw him. There was a face pressed against the window, pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. A man, his face weathered and rough like someone who had spent years working outdoors in harsh conditions. He was staring directly at me with an expression of desperate longing, and his lips were moving like he was trying to speak. The most terrifying part was that he was on the outside of the glass, on the second floor, 40 feet above the ground with nothing beneath him but empty air. He should not have been there. He could not have been there. But he was suspended in the darkness, looking at me with eyes full of terrible sadness and hunger. I jerked the curtains closed and stumbled backward, my breath coming in short gasps. The tapping started again immediately, louder now, more insistent, and I could hear something else underneath it. A voice, muffled by the glass but unmistakable, saying the same words over and over. "Let me in. Let me in from the cold. Please let me in." The voice was rough and desperate, the voice of someone who had been outside in the freezing darkness for a very long time. I stood frozen in the middle of the room, every hair on my body standing up, while that horrible tapping continued and that voice kept begging to be allowed inside. This was not my imagination. This was not wind or ice or the sounds of an old building. Something was outside my window, something that should not exist, and it wanted to come in. I grabbed my phone to call the front desk, but there was no signal. The hotel had landline phones in every room, but when I picked up the receiver, the line was dead. I was alone with whatever was outside that window. The temperature in the room continued to drop. Frost was forming on the inside of the glass now, spreading in patterns that looked almost like reaching fingers. The tapping became frantic, a rapid drumming that sounded like it would shatter the window at any moment. The voice grew louder, more desperate, and now I could hear the words clearly. "Let me in. I am so cold. Please help me. I have been out here so long. Just open the window, just for a moment. Let me feel warmth again." The words were hypnotic, pulling at something deep in my mind, making me feel guilty for being warm and safe while this poor soul suffered in the frozen darkness. My hand moved toward the window latch before I even realized what I was doing. Some part of me wanted to help, wanted to let him in, wanted to ease his suffering. I stopped myself inches from the latch, my fingers trembling. This was wrong. Everything about this was wrong. Dead men do not hover outside second-floor windows. Dead men do not beg to be let in from cold they can no longer feel. Whatever was out there was not human, not anymore, and if I opened that window, something terrible would happen. I backed away and turned on every light in the room, flooding it with as much brightness as I could manage. The tapping faltered for a moment, like the light had surprised or hurt whatever was out there. Then it resumed, even more violent than before, and now I could hear other sounds too. Scratching on the glass, long slow scrapes like fingernails dragging across the surface. A wet breathing sound, rasping and labored. The curtains were moving despite being closed, bulging inward like something was pressing against them from the other side of the glass. I knew I should run, should get out of the room and go sleep in the truck if necessary, but I was paralyzed with fear and a horrible fascination. I needed to understand what this was, What was happening in room 7 of the old loggers hotel that had spawned decades of scary stories and warnings? I grabbed the curtains and yanked them open, confronting whatever was out there face to face. The thing outside recoiled from the sudden light, but not before I got a good look at it. It was shaped like a man, but wrong in ways that hurt to see. Too tall and too thin, with limbs that bent at angles that were not quite human. Its face was the worst part, simultaneously familiar and alien, like someone had reconstructed a human face from memory but gotten the proportions slightly off. The eyes were too large and too dark, holes that seemed to go back forever into nothing. Its mouth was open, and I could see that it had too many teeth, all of them yellow and sharp. It was wearing what looked like old logger-esque clothes from the 1940s, a heavy wool coat and work boots, but the clothes hung on its frame like they were draped over bones with no flesh beneath. This was not a ghost. This was something else. Something that had maybe once been human but had become something different. Something that existed in the space between life and death, trapped in the freezing darkness and desperately trying to find a way back to warmth and light and life. The creature's mouth moved, forming words, and I could hear them despite the closed window. Hear them not with my ears but directly in my mind. Let me in. I was like you once. I worked on the highway. I froze to death out here when I got lost in a storm. I have been outside ever since, watching the warm rooms, watching people sleep safely while I suffer. Just open the window, just for a moment. Let me feel warmth again before I fade completely. The words were designed to create sympathy, to make me feel compassion for this suffering thing, but underneath them was something else. A hunger, a need that went beyond just wanting warmth. This creature wanted to take my place, wanted to steal my warmth and my life and leave me outside in the cold darkness to become like it. I understood now why Margaret had warned me not to open the window no matter how much it begged. Other people had opened it. Other guests in room 7 over the decades had felt that pull of sympathy and guilt, had turned the latch and cracked the window just a little bit to let the poor frozen logger feel a moment of warmth. And those people had disappeared or come back wrong, changed in ways that made them avoid light and seek out cold places, as if something had gotten inside them and was slowly transforming them into creatures like the thing at my window. The hotel had tried closing room 7 permanently, but that had only made things worse. The creature had started appearing at other windows, spreading its attention across the building. The only solution was to keep room 7 occupied, to give the thing a focus, a single window to haunt so it would leave the rest of the hotel alone. I closed the curtains again and spent the rest of the night sitting on the bed with all the lights on, listening to that terrible tapping and that voice begging to be let in. It never stopped, not for a single moment. Tap, 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 let me in. Tap, 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 please. Tap, tap, tap. I am so cold. The sun finally rose around 9 in the morning, and the moment the first rays of daylight touched the window, the tapping stopped. The presence I had felt all night, that oppressive awareness of being watched by something hungry and desperate, vanished like it had never been there. I opened the curtains in the morning light and saw nothing outside but the wall of the hotel, the forest beyond, and the pristine snow covering everything. There were no footprints in the snow below my window. No ladder, no marks on the wall. No evidence that anything had been there. Just like the story said. Just like it had been happening for 60 years. I packed my things and checked out. Margaret looked at me with knowing eyes and asked if I had slept well. I told her the truth. I had not slept at all. She nodded and said most people who stayed in room 7 never came back to the hotel. I asked her why they kept the room available if it was so clearly haunted. She said because the alternative was worse, that if they did not give the lonely logger a window to watch, he would find others, that the entire hotel would become a nightmare instead of just one room. I left Watson Lake that morning and I have never gone back. I rerouted my trucking runs to avoid that stretch of the Alaska Highway, added 8 hours to my trips just so I would never have to stop at the old loggers hotel again. But I have followed the stories over the years, and they continue. Room 7 is still haunted. The face still appears at the window on cold winter nights. The tapping still comes. The voice still begs to be let in from the darkness and the cold. And sometimes, people still open the window. There was a story 5 years ago about a tourist who stayed in room 7 and was found the next morning standing outside in the snow wearing only his underwear, frozen solid, with his hand reaching up toward his own second-floor window like he had been trying to get back inside. The investigation concluded it was suicide or some kind of mental break, but the hotel staff knew better. The man had let the creature in, and the creature had taken what it wanted and discarded what was left. I think about that night a lot. I think about how close I came to opening that window, how strong the pull was to help that suffering thing, to ease its pain even for just a moment. I think about all the truckers and travelers who have stayed in room 7 over the decades, and I wonder how many of them gave in to that impulse. How many of them opened the window just a crack? I think about the stories from Watson Lake, about people who went missing in the winter and were never found, about the occasional bodies discovered in the spring thaw that looked like they had been outside for months but had only been missing for days. I think the lonely logger is not alone anymore. I think he has been adding to his collection, one compassionate fool at a time, creating more creatures like himself to haunt the frozen darkness of the Yukon winter. And I think about the fact that room 7 is booked almost every night, that there is always someone new who does not believe the stories, who thinks they are brave enough or skeptical enough to spend a night in that haunted room. The old Loggers Hotel will never close room 7. They cannot, because the thing outside the window is patient and hungry, and it has learned that sympathy is a better tool than fear. It will keep tapping. It will keep begging. It will keep asking to be let in from the cold, and eventually, someone will always open the window. Story 8. Yukon, Devil, Club. The plant that screams when you pick it. The screaming started 3 days after I pulled that root from the ground. And by the time I understood what was following me home through the darkness, it was already standing outside my cabin door, scraping its fingers against the wood in rhythm with my own terrified heartbeat. My name is Daniel Cruz, and in the summer of 2019 I moved to a remote cabin outside Dawson City in the Yukon Territory. I was running from a divorce, a failed business, and a life in Seattle that had collapsed around me. The cabin was cheap, isolated, surrounded by dense forest that stretched for hundreds of miles in every direction. It seemed like the perfect place to disappear and start over. I had no idea that some places in the wilderness demand respect, and that taking without asking can open doors that should stay permanently closed. I had been living there for about 6 weeks when I first heard about Devil, this club, from a guy named Ray who ran the only supply store within 50 miles. I had come in to buy groceries and mentioned I was interested in learning about native plants, maybe harvesting some natural remedies. Ray's face changed when I said that, got serious in a way that made me uncomfortable. He told me I could pick pretty much anything I wanted except for one plant, and then he described Devil's Club in detail. It grows in the deep forest, thick stalks covered in needle-sharp spines that can pierce through leather gloves, huge maple-like leaves that create dense thickets almost impossible to walk through. The whole plant is covered in those spines, thousands of them, each one capable of breaking off in your skin and causing infections that can last for weeks. But the root, Ray said, that was what people wanted. Indigenous healers had used it for centuries for medicine, for spiritual ceremonies, for protection. The root was powerful. Then Ray leaned across the counter and lowered his voice, told me something that I should have listened to but dismissed as superstition. He said the old-timers and the First Nations elders all agreed on one thing. You never harvest Devil's Club without asking permission first, without showing proper respect to the forest and whatever spirits lived there. If you just took it, if you ripped it from the ground without ceremony or acknowledgement, the plant would scream. And once it screamed, something would know what you had done. Something would follow you. I thanked Ray for the advice and left the store thinking he was just trying to scare the newcomer, sharing local folklore to make himself feel superior. I had a degree in biology from the University of Washington. I did not believe in forest spirits or plants that screamed. I believed in science, in rational explanations, in the physical world that could be measured and understood. 3 days later, I was hiking about 2 miles from my cabin when I found a massive Devil's Club thicket growing along a creek bed. The plants were huge, some of them 8 or 9 feet tall, their spiny stalks as thick as my wrist. I had brought heavy gloves and a small shovel, figuring I would dig up a root section to examine, maybe try processing it the way I had read about in foraging guides. The forest around me was quiet that afternoon, that deep wilderness silence broken only by the sound of the creek and occasional bird calls. The air smelled like pine and damp earth, sunlight filtering through the canopy and scattered beams. It was peaceful, almost meditative, as I knelt beside the largest Devil's Club plant and began digging around its base. The root system was extensive, spreading out in thick tendrils that had to be cut rather than pulled. I worked carefully, trying to extract a section without destroying the whole plant. The spines were everywhere, catching on my clothes, pricking through my gloves in places where the fabric was thin. After about 20 minutes of digging, I finally freed a piece of root about a foot long and as thick as my thumb. The moment I pulled it from the earth, everything changed. The forest went completely silent, like someone had thrown a switch and turned off all natural sound. No birds, no insects, no rustling leaves. Just absolute silence that pressed against my eardrums and made my skin crawl with instinctive wrongness. I froze, the root still clutched in my muddy gloves, looking around at the trees that suddenly seemed darker, more oppressive, leaning in toward me. Then the plant screamed. I know how insane that sounds. Plants do not scream. They do not have vocal cords or lungs or any mechanism to produce sound. But I heard it as clearly as I have ever heard anything in my life. It was a high-pitched shriek that seemed to come from the ground itself, from the exposed roots, from the air around me. It was not a human scream, but something worse, something that vibrated at a frequency that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. The scream lasted maybe 3 seconds, but it felt like minutes. When it finally stopped, the forest remained silent. No gradual return of natural sounds. Just that oppressive quiet that felt like the woods themselves were watching me, waiting to see what I would do next. I should have put the root back. I should have apologized, performed whatever ceremony or acknowledgement Ray had been talking about. Instead, I panicked. I shoved the root into my backpack and started walking quickly back toward my cabin, telling myself I had imagined it, that it was wind through the hollow stalks or some acoustic trick of the terrain. But I could not shake the feeling that something had noticed what I had done. The hike back felt wrong. Shadows moving in my peripheral vision, branches cracking in the forest behind me even though there was no wind. I kept looking over my shoulder, seeing nothing but feeling watched with an intensity that made my hands shake and my breath come faster. I reached the cabin just before sunset and locked the door behind me, suddenly grateful for the solid walls and the heavy deadbolt. I put the devil as club root on my kitchen counter and tried to calm down, poured myself a whiskey and turned on the radio for company. The cabin felt too quiet, too isolated, the forest pressing close against the windows. Nothing happened that first night. I convinced myself I had overreacted, that the scream had been my imagination or possibly some animal I was not familiar with. I went to bed around midnight and slept poorly, waking several times to silence and darkness, that feeling of being watched still lingering at the edges of my consciousness. The second night, I started hearing the footsteps. They began around 2 a.m, slow and deliberate, circling my cabin in the darkness. Crunch, crunch, crunch through the pine needles and undergrowth, moving with a steady rhythm that was almost hypnotic. I lay in bed listening, trying to convince myself it was a moose or a bear, but the pattern was wrong. The steps were too measured, too purposeful, and they stayed just beyond the reach of the motion sensor light I had installed near the door. I got up and looked out the window, pressing my face against the cold glass and peering into the darkness. The forest was a wall of black tree trunks barely visible in the starlight. I could not see what was making the sound, but I could hear it clearly, circling counterclockwise around the cabin, maintaining perfect distance. Then I saw the shadow. It was standing between 2 spruce trees about 30 feet from the window, tall and impossibly thin, darker than the surrounding darkness. It was not moving, just standing there, and even though I could not make out any features, I knew it was looking at me. I could feel its attention like a physical weight, pressing against the glass, against my chest, making it hard to breathe. I backed away from the window and turned on every light in the cabin, suddenly desperate for illumination, for anything that would push back that darkness. The footsteps continued for another hour before finally stopping, leaving me alone with my racing heart and the certain knowledge that something was out there, something that had followed me home from that creek bed. The third night was when it started touching the cabin, scraping sounds along the walls, slow and rhythmic, like fingers dragging across wood. It started at the back of the cabin and moved around to the front, taking its time, making sure I heard every scratch. I sat at my kitchen table with a hunting rifle across my lap, listening to that horrible sound, knowing that the walls were thick enough to stop it but terrified of what would happen if it found a way inside. Around 4 a.m, it began scratching at the door. Long, slow drags from top to bottom, like it was measuring, learning the dimensions, figuring out how to get through. I sat 15 feet away, staring at that door, watching the deadbolt and praying it would hold. The scratching continued for hours, methodical and patient, and I understood that this thing was not going to leave, that it would keep coming back night after night until something gave way. When dawn finally came and the scratching stopped, I did not feel relief. I felt exhausted and defeated, understanding that I had made a terrible mistake and had no idea how to fix it. I looked at the devil, his club root still sitting on my counter, and knew it was connected, that pulling it from the ground had marked me somehow, had drawn the attention of something that did not forgive trespasses. I drove into town that morning and found Ray at his store. He took one look at my face and knew immediately what had happened. He asked if I had taken devil, his club, without permission, and when I nodded, he just shook his head slowly, disappointment and pity in his eyes. Ray gave me the name of a woman, an elder from the trail, Ondekwek, in First Nation, who lived on the reserve outside Dawson. He said she might be able to help, that she understood the old ways and knew how to deal with spirits that had been offended. He also said there were no guarantees, that some mistakes could not be undone. I found her cabin that afternoon. Her name was Margaret, and she was in her 70s, with gray hair and eyes that seemed to look right through me. I told her everything, the whole story, and she listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time before speaking. She said the forest has rules that existed long before humans came to this land, rules that indigenous people learned to respect over thousands of years. Devil's club is sacred, connected to spirits that protect the deep wilderness. Taking it without proper ceremony, without acknowledgement and offering, is seen as theft, as disrespect. The scream I heard was an alarm, a notification to those spirits that someone had violated the sacred. What was following me, Margaret said, was not exactly a spirit and not exactly a physical being. It existed in between, drawn to the violation, feeding on fear and guilt. It would keep coming, keep escalating, until I made things right or until it decided I had been punished enough. Sometimes that punishment was just terror. Sometimes it was worse. Margaret gave me instructions. I had to return to the exact spot where I had taken the root. I had to bring tobacco and sage in red cloth, traditional offerings. I had to replant what I had taken, perform a ceremony of apology and respect, acknowledge my ignorance and ask forgiveness. And I had to do it alone, without weapons, showing trust and vulnerability. She said there was no guarantee it would work. Some spirits accepted apologies, others did not, but it was the only chance I had. I went back the next morning, carrying the devil, this club root, in the offerings Margaret had given me. The hike to the creek felt different now, the forest watching with anticipation rather than hostility. When I reached the thicket, I knelt in the exact spot where I had dug, and I replanted the root carefully, packing earth around it and watering it from the creek. Then I performed the ceremony as Margaret had taught me, burning sage and tobacco, laying out red cloth, speaking words in a language I barely understood, but that felt heavy with meaning. I apologized, acknowledged my ignorance and disrespect, asked forgiveness from whatever spirits governed this place. The forest remained silent throughout, but the quality of that silence changed. It felt less hostile, more watchful, like something was considering whether to accept what I offered. I walked home slowly, uncertain whether I had done enough. That night I sat in my cabin with all the lights on, waiting for the footsteps to start, for the scratching at the door. But nothing came. The forest outside remained quiet, normal sounds gradually returning, owls calling and small animals rustling through the underbrush. A week passed, then two, with no sign of whatever had been stalking my cabin. I started to believe that the ceremony had worked, that Margaret's instructions had satisfied the spirits and ended the nightmare. I started sleeping through the night, stopped checking the windows constantly, slowly relaxed back into the rhythm of isolated living. But then, 3 weeks after replanting the root, I found something on my doorstep that made my blood run cold. It was a small bundle, wrapped in that same red cloth I had left at the creek, tied with dried plant material that I recognized as devil's club stem. Inside was a single root section, the exact piece I had taken and replanted. I unwrapped it with shaking hands and found something carved into the root's surface, symbols or writing that I did not recognize but that radiated menace and warning. The message was clear. My offering had been rejected. The spirits had returned what I tried to give back, marking it as insufficient, inadequate. That night the footsteps returned, closer than before, right up against the cabin walls. The scratching started again, more aggressive, more insistent. And I understood with horrible certainty that this was not going to end, that I had violated something fundamental and there was no ceremony or apology that would make it right. I left the Yukon 2 days later, abandoning the cabin and everything in it. driving south toward Alaska and civilization and places where the forest did not have rules that humans could violate. I told myself I was escaping, that distance would break whatever connection had been formed. But sometimes late at night, no matter where I am or how many locks are on my door, I hear those footsteps circling in the darkness. I hear the slow scratch of fingers against wood, patient and methodical, reminding me that some debts follow you forever. The devil, as clubroot, is still somewhere in that abandoned cabin, marked with symbols I could not read, a permanent record of my violation. And somewhere in the deep Yukon forest, the spirits wait, patient and eternal, protecting their sacred places from those foolish enough to take without permission. The horror is not that the plant screamed. The horror is that something heard it, something old and unforgiving, and no amount of distance or time will ever make it forget what I did that afternoon by the creek. Story 9. Vanished Patrol. 4 RCMP officers lost in a blizzard. Cover-up. I found the camp exactly the way they left it 113 years ago, and that discovery has haunted every moment of my life since. My name is Thomas Brennan, and I am a retired park ranger from the Yukon Territory. What I am about to tell you is the most terrifying true story I have ever experienced, and it involves a cover-up that has been kept secret for over a century. 4 Royal Canadian Mounted Police officers vanished into a blizzard in 1911, and the official report says they died of exposure. But I know the truth now, and I wish to God I did not. This nightmare began last winter when I took a solo expedition into the backcountry north of Dawson City. I have been hiking these mountains for 40 years, and I thought I knew every trail, every valley, every dangerous spot. But the wilderness up there is vast, and there are still places where no human has walked in generations. Places where the snow never fully melts and the darkness feels thicker than it should. I was following an old trapper route when the storm hit. It came out of nowhere, the way blizzards do in the Yukon, turning the world white in seconds. Visibility dropped to nothing. The wind howled like something alive and angry. I knew I had to find shelter immediately or I would die out there. I stumbled through the blinding snow for what felt like hours, my face numb, my fingers losing feeling inside my gloves. Just when I thought I could not go any further, I saw shapes ahead. Dark forms barely visible through the whiteout. Tense, I pushed forward, desperate, and broke through into a small clearing. And there, perfectly preserved in the frozen wilderness, was the camp. 4 canvas tents arranged in a square, a fire pit in the center with blackened logs still stacked as if ready to burn. Rifles leaning against tent poles. Supply crates marked with RCMP insignia from 1911. Everything covered in over a century of ice and snow, but intact. Untouched, like the men who made this camp had simply stepped away for a moment and never returned. My heart was pounding as I approached the nearest tent. The canvas was frozen solid, but I managed to pull back the flap and look inside. Sleeping bags laid out neatly. Personal items arranged on makeshift shelves. A journal sitting open on a wooden crate, the pages covered in ice but the writing still visible underneath. I knew immediately what I had found. This was the Lost Patrol from 1911. 4 Mounties who disappeared during a routine mail run between Fort McPherson and Dawson City. The search parties back then had looked for months but found nothing. The case was eventually closed, the men declared dead, and the whole incident was quietly buried in bureaucratic files. But here was their camp, exactly as they left it. And something about that felt very, very wrong. I ducked into the largest tent to escape the storm, my hands shaking as I tried to start my portable stove. The wind screamed outside, battering the ancient canvas, but the tent held. I sat there in the eerie darkness, surrounded by the belongings of dead men, and tried to understand what I was seeing. The official report said the patrol got lost in a blizzard and died of exposure. Their bodies were supposedly never recovered because of the harsh terrain and weather. But if that was true, why was this camp so perfectly intact? Why were the rifles still here? Why had they left food cooking on the fire and their weapons behind? Men dying of exposure do not set up camp this carefully and then abandon it. They do not leave their survival gear behind. Something else happened here. Something the authorities did not want anyone to know about. I pulled out my flashlight and began examining the camp more carefully. The journal in the first tent was frozen solid, but I could make out some of the words through the ice. The entries were dated January 9th through January 14th, 1911. The writing was neat and professional at first, typical daily reports of distance traveled and weather conditions. But the later entries were different. The handwriting got shaky, erratic, and the content became increasingly disturbing. January 12th, strange lights seen on the horizon after dark. All 4 men witnessed, not aurora, something else, moving with purpose. January 13th, the lights came closer last night. We heard sounds outside the camp, footsteps in the snow, but when we searched, we found no tracks. Morrison is spooked, says he saw a figure standing at the edge of camp, too tall to be human. January 14th, something is wrong with the darkness here. It feels alive, watches us. We have decided to break camp at first light and return to Fort McPherson immediately. God help us. That was the last entry. I sat back, my breath fogging in the frozen air, trying to process what I had just read. These were experienced officers, trained observers. They would not make up stories about strange lights and impossible figures. They saw something out here. Something that terrified them so badly they abandoned their mission. And then they vanished. I should have left that camp immediately. Should have marked the location and reported it to the authorities. But the storm was still raging outside, and I had no choice but to wait it out. So I settled into the tent, wrapped in my sleeping bag, trying to ignore the creeping fear that was crawling up my spine. That was when I heard the footsteps. Slow, deliberate, crunching through the snow outside the tent, circling the camp. I froze, barely breathing, listening. The storm was still howling, but underneath that sound I could hear something moving. Something big. I grabbed my rifle and aimed it at the tent entrance, my finger on the trigger, waiting. The footsteps stopped directly outside. I could see a shadow on the canvas, tall and thin, blocking the faint light from outside. Then a voice spoke. It did not come from outside the tent. It came from inside my head, a voice like grinding ice and hollow wind, speaking words I should not have been able to understand but somehow did. You found them, now you will join them. I squeezed the trigger without thinking. The rifle blast was deafening in the small space, tearing a hole through the ancient canvas. But there was nothing outside. No body, no blood, just empty snow and darkness. I scrambled out of the tent, my rifle raised, spinning in circles, searching for whatever had been there. The storm had stopped, the wind had died, and the silence that followed was the most terrifying thing I have ever experienced. Complete, absolute, suffocating silence. No wind, no animal sounds, not even the creak of ice and snow settling. Just silence so heavy it pressed against my ears like hands. That was when I saw the lights. They appeared on the horizon, exactly like the journal described. Blue and white and cold, pulsing slowly, moving across the frozen landscape with impossible grace. Not aurora, not natural, something else, something ancient and aware. The lights moved toward the camp, and I felt that presence again, pushing into my mind. Cold, patient, hungry. I understood then what had happened to those 4 Mounties in 1911. They had encountered something out here in the wilderness, something that did not belong in our world. And it had taken them, not killed them, taken them, to wherever those lights came from. I ran. I left everything behind except my rifle and ran blindly into the darkness, away from the camp, away from those lights. I do not know how long I ran, hours maybe, until exhaustion dropped me face first into the snow. When I woke up, it was morning. I was less than a mile from the main trail, close enough to civilization that I could hike out easily. But when I looked back toward where the camp should have been, I saw nothing. Just empty wilderness. No tents, no clearing, like the whole thing had never existed. I reported what I found to the RCMP, gave them exact coordinates, led them to the location. We searched for 3 days. We found nothing. No camp, no artifacts, no evidence that anyone had ever been there. They think I hallucinated the whole thing. Exposure and isolation playing tricks on my mind. The official report says I got lost in a storm and my brain created a vivid fantasy to cope with the stress. But I know what I saw. I know what I found. And I know why the 1911 case was covered up. Because whatever took those 4 men is still out there. Still waiting in the frozen darkness. And the authorities know about it. They have always known. They just cannot acknowledge it without causing panic. I did some research after I recovered. Dug through historical archives, old newspapers, forgotten reports. And I found a pattern. Every 10 to 15 years, someone goes missing in that exact area. Experienced hikers, trappers, rangers. They vanish without a trace. And the official explanation is always the same. Lost in a storm. Died of exposure. Body never recovered. But I found something else too. In the really old records, from before the RCMP existed. First Nation stories about that region. They called it the place where people disappear. They said there were spirits there, ancient and cold, that took humans sometimes. For what purpose, they did not know, but they warned people to stay away, especially in winter when the darkness was strongest. The last disappearance before mine was 12 years ago, which means someone else is about due. I moved away from the Yukon 6 months ago, took a job down in Vancouver, as far south as I could get while staying in Canada. I tell myself I am retired, that I earned a quiet life after 40 years in the wilderness. But I know the real reason I left. I am running, and I do not think I can run far enough. Because 3 nights ago, I woke up at 3 in the morning and saw lights outside my window. Blue and white and cold, pulsing slowly in the darkness. And I heard that voice again, inside my head, speaking words that turned my blood to ice. We found you. You cannot leave. You belong to the darkness now. The lights disappeared after a few seconds, but I know they will come back. Whatever took those 4 Mounties in 1911 has marked me. And sooner or later, probably when winter comes and the nights grow long, it will take me too. I am writing this down as a record, as proof, so that when I disappear, someone will know the truth. The official report will say I got lost, that I died of exposure, that my body was never recovered. But you will know better. You will know that I was taken, like those 4 officers, like all the others who vanished in that cursed place. Taken into the cold darkness by something we were never meant to encounter. And if you ever find yourself in the Yukon backcountry in winter, and you see strange lights on the horizon, do not investigate. Do not try to understand. Just run. Run as fast as you can and pray that whatever lives in that darkness has not noticed you yet. Because once it marks you, there is nowhere you can hide. The lights are outside my window again tonight, and this time they are not leaving.